begin an excerpt from a book by Joseph de Maistre, a series of refutations called Against Rousseau, a refutation of the key tenets not only of Rousseau, but of the French Revolution, and of the French Revolution, some of the undergirding pillars of modern statecraft and modern conceptions of government. Speaking of the sovereignty of nations, that is, the authority of nations, Joseph de Maistre here, in this excerpt, will begin to describe how nations are born, but not in a way you would ordinarily hear described. He will begin to show how the sinews and bones and the features, as it were, are formed peculiar of nations. And so he says, nations are born and perish like individuals. Nations have fathers, literally, and founders, ordinarily more celebrated than their fathers. Although the greatest merit of these founders was to penetrate the character of an infant people, and to place it in circumstances that could develop it fully. These founders are peculiar characters ordained by God to realize the personality of a nation, not single-handedly, but by the aid of the Creator, through a special orchestration of circumstance, place, and other happenings, cause the nation to flourish, as a tutor causes his student's soul to flourish and reach the level of prodigy. And so he continues, nations have a common soul, and a true moral unity that makes them what they are. This unity is announced above all by language. Language represents how our intellect captures the world, and the language of a people, how the collective intellect, if you will, perceives the world. We don't deny unifying philosophical principles. We're not saying that they create their own vision of reality in a strict sense, but they do have a peculiar preponderance to describing certain aspects of reality in certain ways, manifest in choice of words, sayings, and even accents. The Creator laid out the limits of nations, says Joseph, on the globe, and St. Paul spoke philosophically to the Athenians when he said to them, "From one man he has created the whole human race, and made them to live all over the face of the earth, determining their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands." These boundaries are visible, and we always see each nation straining to fill up completely one of the spaces enclosed within these boundaries. And these boundaries are not artificially laid down by some statesman, but these boundaries are determined by God. As families grow and they make use of the various resources of the land, and through other happenings, to use the term again, end up taking up a certain space. And when we step back and analyze several generations, we see that these people seem to have, in an orchestrated manner that transcends each generation, filled up a certain boundary. This orchestration is the work of God. Thus, Joseph de Maistre says, the Creator laid out the limits of nations on the globe. Sometimes, says de Maistre, invisible circumstances precipitate two nations into one another and force them to mingle. Then their constituting principles interpenetrate, and the resulting hybrid nation can be more or less powerful and renowned than the pure race was. We can think of Portugal intermingling with the barbarian tribes of Brazil, coming together, their constituting principles, say the virtues they're most inclined towards, the shining virtues of the Portuguese and the shining virtues of the Brazilian tribes, come together and form something new. Speaking on the character of a nation, de Maistre says, no nation is able to give itself the character or position that renders it fit for a particular government. All agree not only in believing this truth in an abstract way, but in believing that the divinity has intervened directly in the establishment of their particular sovereignties. The sacred scripture shows us the first king of the chosen people, elected and consecrated by an immediate intervention of the divinity. The annals of every nation of the world assign the same origin to their particular governments. The names change, all after following the succession of their princes back to somewhat remote epoch, finally arrive at those mythological times, whose true history would instruct us much better than all the others. All show us the cradle of sovereignty, surrounded by miracles. Always divinity intervenes in the foundation of empires. Always the first sovereign, at least, is the favorite of heaven. He receives the scepter from the hands of the divinity. Divinity communicates with him. It inspires him. It engraves on his forehead the sign of power. And the laws that he dictates to his fellows are only the fruit of his celestial communications. These are fables, says the Maistre, they will say. In truth, I know nothing about it. However, the fables of all peoples, even modern peoples, cover many realities. The holy ampoule, for example, is the only hieroglyph. It suffices to know how to read. The healing power attributed to certain princes or to certain dynasties of princes also results from this universal dogma of the divine origin of sovereignty. Do not be surprised that the antique founders of nations all spoke in the name of God. They sensed that they did not have a right to speak in their own name. It is moreover that we can say without exaggeration, Es Deus in nobis agitante celescimus ipsu. There is a God within us. It is when he stirs that our bosom warms. Ovid. This century's philosophers have complained a great deal about the alliance between empire and priesthood. Men have undoubtedly abused everything, but the wise observer cannot dispense himself from admiring their obstinacy in blending these two things, empire and priesthood, the laws of God and the laws of man. He continues, the more one goes back towards antiquity, the more one finds religious legislation, or we can say legislation which reposes upon the legislation of God. Everything that nations have told us of their origins proves that they are agreed in regarding sovereignty as divine in its essence. Otherwise, they would all have told us very different tales. Never do they speak to us of a primordial contract, of voluntary association, of popular deliberation. This, of course, is the doctrines that foment from the French Revolution, and whose paroxysms or seeds are contained in the Protestant revolt. Rousseau, of course, believes that the origins of power reside within man, not God, and so the efficacy of law comes when two men agree, rather than God bringing two men to agree and granting them the capacity to decree what is just. No historian, says the Maistre, cites the primary assemblies of Memphis or Babylon. It is truly folly to imagine that this universal prejudice is the work of sovereigns. That is to say, that divine sanction of authority is merely the machination of the mind of man. Special interest, he says, might well abuse the general belief, but it can't create it. Or in other words, men of a Machiavellian mind may take advantage of religion, but religion is not the construct of man. It is natural, and nature is created by God. If that of which I speak had not been founded on the inner consent of peoples, not only could they have not been made to adopt it, but the sovereigns could not have imagined such a fraud. In general, every universal idea here, the divine origins of authority, is natural. By me, says Christ, kings reign. Modern man says, by me, a man, kings reign.